students, it's week 8 and we are still talking about poetry. I hope you're finding a lot of joy in trying to work through these poems. I do want to talk about your essays for just a second if I could here. Let me actually switch screen. So one thing that I am noticing as I'm reading through your essays is that some of you have missed the mark in terms of coming up with a theme for these stories, which concerns me because we're also trying to find meaning of poems, which is very similar to theme in story. So one thing I just want to point out here with How to Be Chinese in particular is that with your thesis, right, let's say those of you who just wrote on this particular story, you would want to have a thesis that's an arguable claim, right? And when I say arguable claim, it's not a statement of fact about the story. A thesis isn't going to be something like Mackenzie Altman is trying to find out about her culture of origin or something like that. That's a fact of the story. That's actually going on. So if you were to try to use that as a thesis, you're just going to end up sort of giving the facts of the story and there's no real analysis going on, right? If you were to give a thesis that is arguable, it might look something more like, and I'm just doing this off the top of my head, by the way, so I'm sure it could be better or more refined. But maybe a better thesis, working thesis might be something like, although Mackenzie Altman is trying to find out about her culture of origin, or her Chinese culture of origin, she will ultimately always exist in the liminal space between American and Chinese. Right? And then my whole paper can prove how she exists in both worlds at the same time and never fully in one or the other, right? And that's more analytical. That is using those key components of the story in order to prove that she's always going to stay in that space and never fully in the American space and never fully in the Chinese space. So, a couple other things I wanted to point out here is that the POV is also second person. Several of you have said that this is first person, and it is not first person. It's in the second person, and it's a weird story because ultimately Mackenzie is giving herself advice on how to be Chinese. And you could really use that point of view to help support this idea of how you feel about Mackenzie and her acquisition of her culture. So for instance, right, because the point of view is in second person, there's a distancing effect that it has, right? Some of you have pointed out that Mackenzie is giving herself commands to try to walk herself through how to be Chinese. And so that point of view fits perfectly with what she's actually aiming to do, which is to be Chinese, right? If she told this from the first person perspective, right, she would sort of say something like, if even just looking at this first paragraph here, I really take pleasure in the surprise on people's faces when I say, my name is Mackenzie Altman. Right? So that's a different kind of perspective than her telling herself, right? Mackenzie can't even be in her own body, right? And tell a first person story because her whole life she's been sort of given other people's stories to tell, right? Same thing with her American culture. She's been given that by her birth mother, by her adopted mother, right? So that formalist critique that I ask you to use, asks you to take particular elements of fiction, like symbol, like setting, like point of view, and to really tie that back into how you're seeing the meaning of the story. And so there are lots of different meanings that many of you came up with, and that's totally fine. I just kind of want to take this moment to point out that we want to come up with arguable things, which is why it's hard, which is part of what makes literature hard, and a lot of people tend to shut down when it comes to that because it feels like there could be endless amounts of answers. And the reality is that yes, there are several answers to every single story, and there are several different interpretations to every single poem, but you are looking for what works with your brain, your experiences, and your reading of that. And how can you support that with the text in front of you? So again, I'm working my way through those essays. I hope to be done this week. Those of you who have already had your essays graded, you can see those comments right on turnitin.com. So make sure that you are checking back in there and you're reading through everything. So I expect that you would read through that before you ask me questions. Certainly I do welcome the questions. I'm happy to point out how things could have been better, or how, how successful you were in this, that, or the other thing. This week we're going to be talking about poetic language in particular. Many of you have already been talking about those things in your week 7 and week 6 discussion boards, so this should feel very familiar to you. Particularly, your book is going to point out metaphor, simile, paradox, oxymoron, and absolutely, yes, I want you to know what those things are, and I want you to practice talking in terms of those terms. But also too, I want you to be sure that you pay attention in chapter 19. I feel like many of you are skipping over some of the blue pages and the sample student papers, and maybe that's where we are, for some of you, have kind of missed each other in terms of how is an argument paper written on literature. So please be sure that in all of these chapters that I assign you to read, not only are you picking up all of the new terms and how to apply those terms, but that you're also reading through. So for instance, I'm on page 429 right now, which is a student sample paper of a final draft. Images of Love is what the student paper is called, but it's just a sample essay of what a student's paper might look like if they were writing about this particular poem. And so reading those is going to help inform how you talk about poetry too. I'm not saying all of these are perfect or wonderful, but they're good examples generally. And usually they have to do with what the chapter is talking about and how to actually sort of, it models for you how to talk about language within a particular poem. So please be sure that you're paying attention to those kinds of things in there. All right, so poetic language, super important that we actually kind of talk about poetic language in the sense of, one thing that I want you to do when you read through these poems is, yes, you're going to read through and literally understand what is going on. And then maybe the second, third, fourth time through when you're reading this is really dissecting the language here. So if there are multiple meanings to a word, you should write those things down. I still look up dictionary definitions of words that I actually know what they mean, because I'm trying to see, hey, could it mean both things, right? So understanding that there are multiple meanings of every single word. So your denotation, right, is your dictionary definition of words. So make sure just on a sort of literal level that you do know what all of these words mean, right? When you come across this fourth line here, they pace and sleek chivalric certainty, right? You understand what that means, right? Same thing with connotation, right? All that connotation means is that there's an emotional tone to a word. So for instance, I think your book gives a definition about father or mother or any sort of parental kind of word. For some people, that has a negative connotation. To me, father can mean a very sort of formal way of speaking to your biological dad, right? For some people, it's a very endearing term, and it just depends on how that word is couched in a line in a poem, how that's going to sound and what the tone is going to mean. So understand that there's also sort of emotional impact of words. Connotation too can sometimes mean a cultural or social understanding of a word as well, right? You could say that someone is cold, right? And on the literal level, on the denotative level, that would mean that their body temperature might actually be low or cold. But it could also mean that someone's heartless. So there's another definition there, which we would call connotation, which is sort of that cultural implication of being cold to someone actually means emotionally distant. So I put Aunt Jennifer's Tiger's poem up on the screen because I think it's really important to understand that there's the literal level of what's going on, and you have Aunt Jennifer who is embroidering a tapestry of these beautiful tigers, and these tigers are brightly colored. They don't fear the men that are also in the tapestry, and that even after Aunt Jennifer's death, right, these tigers are going to go on prancing, and they're going to be proud and unafraid. That's happening on the sort of connotative level, or excuse me, the denotative level, the literal level. But when we start picking some of these other words apart, we're going to notice something else that happens with this particular poem. So we have this sense that Aunt Jennifer, right there in that second stanza especially, right, her fingers are fluttering through the wool, and she's having a hard time pulling that needle through that wool. And so that tells you something there. That could be something that, you know, maybe fear, maybe age, right, something like that. But then we get to this third line, and it says the massive weight under Uncle's wedding band. That tells us something really significant about Uncle, right? Uncle's massive, the massive weight of his wedding band says that that he's in control in some way. If you think about a wedding band, right, it's actually like a collar of sorts. And if it has sort of a massive weight on Aunt Jennifer's hand and it sits heavily on her hand, oh, which you can see I misspelled that word right there. Let's see if I can stick that in. Right. What happens here is that we get this sense that Uncle is this kind of overbearing man, and he is putting pressure on Aunt Jennifer in a way, or maybe just sort of demanding, or you know, is kind of tough on her in some way. When we get to this third stanza and she is dead, right, her terrified hand, right, will lie. And we understand that to mean that, okay, so her hands in the second stanza weren't actually, I think it's supposed to be hands too, her hands weren't actually tired or old necessarily, they were terrified, right? So that changes how we might see Uncle. So maybe he's not just overbearing, but he's actually kind of abusive, right? And if we continue this line, will lie still ringed, right? The ring, think of wedding ring, but also think of ring as in when we wring someone's neck too. So I've mentioned to you guys many times before, my mother is from the South, and growing up, they would have to wring the necks of chickens, where you just essentially pick up a chicken by its neck and you swing it around in a circle very, very quickly, and it kills them. And so here we have the word spelled ringed as in ring on a finger, but you can also hear the word ring as in wrung a neck. And so she is still ringed with these ordeals that she was mastered by. So again, that tells us about that relationship that Aunt Jennifer had with Uncle. And it was not a good relationship. It was an abusive relationship. So what I'm showing you here is that I'm just picking through these words and coming up with meaning that is a little harder to unpack through the first couple of reads, right? You really have to kind of go slow and translate each one of these lines and ask yourself if there's multiple meanings here of the connotation and the denotations. So metaphor and simile we've been reading about for quite a few weeks. Well, even back in fiction we were reading, short fiction, we were reading that as well. So in the long haul, here it's on page 2. This is by Hayden Carruth. So I put this poem up here, and you're going to be reading this in chapter 19, but because what we have in the entire poem is what's called an extended metaphor. And it's important to note that it's an extended metaphor carries through a poem for a long ways. It's not just a line or two. It happens to be throughout the poem or throughout a bigger piece of a poem. So it goes on for just more than a beat or two. And what we have here in the long haul is this idea of a man who is weaving a tapestry. And as you read this poem, which again you will during this your reading of chapter 19, or if you already have, you start to understand that the tapestry and the idea of weaving a tapestry becomes kind of an extended metaphor, almost for life, or sort of the trials and successes that we have in life. And sometimes it seems kind of not worth it. And you can see that, you know, the tapestry of life is kind of unwinding as you already knot it. And so what's the point of continuing on, right? And so that's what we would call extended metaphor. So pay attention for those kinds of things. So not just regular sort of comparisons with metaphor or similes, right? Particularly using the word like or as, but extended metaphor too. Also, personification here is important. I don't have a slide dedicated just to personification, but pay attention for those things, or even anthropomorphication, right? That can be very important. Imagery is something else we want to pay attention to. And this is August by Mary Oliver, who's known as the nature poet. And imagery just says, hey, what are those images that are being constructed here, and how are they coming to life? Or do they have a lot of concrete details? What are those? And August is a beautiful example of a poem that is full of imagery. And I'm just going to read it because it's just that beautiful. When the blackberries hang swollen in the woods, in the brambles nobody owns, I spend all day among the high branches, reaching my ripped arms, thinking of nothing, cramming the black honey of summer into my mouth. All day my body accepts what it is. In the dark creeks that run by there is this thick paw of my life darting among the blackbells, the leaves. There is this happy tongue. And so we get these beautiful images of blackberries that are swollen right in the woods. We get the speaker who's climbing up through the brambles of the bush, the blackberry bushes, right, ripping through the speaker's arms. I think my favorite line in the whole poem is this idea of cramming the black honey of summer into the speaker's mouth, right? And just that image here, right? That blackberries are described as black honey. So they're thick, they're sweet, and the speaker is not just eating them or placing them in his or her mouth, right? But the speaker is cramming them. They're trying to shove every possible, right, piece of that black honey of summer, by the way, into the mouth, right? Which for me, as a teacher, I can certainly relate to this idea of just wanting to sort of stuff yourself full of the good, sweet things of summer, right? This is, for me, the time usually, and probably for you as students as well, right? Where you can not, or maybe enjoy your families, or maybe have a moment to yourself, or to lay by the pool, or to read a book for fun, or whatever it is that you enjoy doing. I get to do all of those things during summer. And so I feel this connection with that particular line of cramming all that sweet goodness of summer, right, into myself as much as I can, because I know it's going to soon be over. And so this is, again, just a really great example of those images that just sort of stack up and get better and better as the poem goes on. And it really gives you a sense of where the speaker is, what the speaker is talking about, and how the speaker feels about that particular subject. I also don't have a full slide developed to paradox, but you really should know what a paradox is. Same thing with oxymoron, right? And I will point out that on page 422 in Donald Hall's poem, My Son, My Executioner, we have a paradox here. And so I ask you that you think about what is that paradox of the speaker? In fact, it's right there in the title, My Son, My Executioner. Why is the speaker sort of saying it like that? And what possibly could that mean? Why say it in that particular language? Last thing here I want to talk about is symbol. Again, we've been working with this for a few weeks now. I hope that you can start to point out that things aren't always what they seem. particularly with writers. Poets, even more so than short story writers, even more so than novelists, are really paying attention for how does one thing maybe sort of represent other things. And I pulled up Kay Ryan's Turtle here on page 420, which is a wonderful example of symbol. The poem is about a turtle, yes, but it could also be about something else as well. And I don't necessarily want to give it away or give you my interpretation, because I think you should read this poem and enjoy it and think to yourself, yes, okay, she is a turtle. Here are all the things, right, that the turtle has to go through. But what else, or maybe who else could this poem be about? And maybe what is Kay Ryan trying to say here? What's the symbol of the turtle? And so thinking about words and language and how they mean different things on different levels is really what we're trying to do this week. Also notice too, let me see if I can pull back into that slide. As we move into form next week, right? Pay attention for things like that now. If you look at turtle, which is right here, formatted just the way it is in our book, right? We don't have lines that are spaced apart. We have sort of one chunked up poem here, which kind of just looks like, you know, the back of a turtle, if you will, or at least sort of it's like one whole unit, right? Which the turtle is one whole unit when you think of the reptile and its shell. If you had a whole bunch of lines here that had a bunch of white space between them, you wouldn't quite have the same visual effect. And so when you think about form, yes, we're going to think about things like forms in terms of sonnets or villanelles or pantoums, right? Any of those traditional forms, but also like how do poems look on a particular page, and what might that sort of suggest about, you know, that poem. In the long haul, and I've only given you a little brief part of it here, it's a long, not really skinny poem, but it's a long sort of narrower poem, which could mimic the way that a hall looks, right? So think about those kinds of things as you are talking about your poems this week. Just to look at some of the stuff here, you're going to read and take notes, of course. I always suggest that on poetic language itself. Again, make sure that you do understand what symbol is, what paradoxes, oxymoron, that kind of stuff. You are also going to read Introduction to Poetry, which is an amazing poem that I often like to start my 7D classes with. So that's a creative writing poetry class, because it's a great way to kind of introduce students to poetry. And it's kind of funny from the perspective of Billy Collins, who is not only a poet, twice a poet laureate, right, but a teacher as well, and how he touches on how to introduce students to poetry. So I hope you find some kind of joy in that particular poem. The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. Don't overthink this one. This is a tiny little poem, but just look at it, you know, look at that language. What is it trying to say? You know, which can really trip up some students because there's not a lot of words there. Barbie Doll, I have a feeling that Barbie Doll and Sex Without Love, you guys will have a lot to say on this week, which is great. I hope you do. And Bully. And so again, make sure you are looking up many definitions of those words. Make sure you take your quiz by Wednesday. You have to post your discussion board by Thursday and your responses to 2 discussion boards by Saturday. So if you have any questions, please make sure you email me and let me know. I will try to set up a live chat this week so that we can go through those poems, but keep up the good work. I have a feeling this stuff is starting to settle in a little bit more. All right, y'all, take care. Bye.